This was, we did an exhibit a while ago for Harbourfront Centre. They asked us to do an exhibit about history in Toronto. And I thought for fun, and this is maybe a question for the ACO, I thought for fun we'd say, well, hey, I understand we're trying to protect heritage buildings, we're trying to identify heritage buildings. I thought just for fun, what are the oldest buildings in the city? And we'll just do an exhibit on that, kind of just keep a blinker on it. And we took the Bolton Atlas from 1858, Bolton Atlas, which is the first time the City of Toronto actually mapped out all the buildings in the city very thoroughly, very accurately. And we thought, this is great. And kind of for fun, we said, well, let's just see how many of those buildings might still be around. And we'll do that kind of, and part of it's a question, which I think is good for the ACO, is like, what do we value about what's old? What do we not value? Are we serious about preserving things? Is it only designation, we must designate and protect, or are there other ways to look and understand our history? So it was kind of a fun exercise. We treated it like a scientific experiment. We pretended we were like a CSI or something like that, very scientific, and we pinned and identified things, and we were really careful to kind of analyze what we're looking at. We actually did use pins, so we actually pinned onto the atlas the buildings that we found that we could still find that they existed in the city. It was much different than what we thought. Many buildings, some of them were common ones we knew exactly. On this slide, you might U16 is the St. Lawrence Hall, St. Lawrence Market. We went to the city directories, and through the city directories, amazingly accurate ways to, and this is the atlas from that year, directory from that year, we're able to look very carefully and sort of say, well, we could actually understand who lived in these buildings, for sure when they were built. A lot of, because this was an exhibition, we were just trying our best to kind of understand. There's a lot of complexity. We weren't sure exactly we had the right building. We weren't sure it had been replaced at some point. We went into the directory and identified where the buildings were referenced in the directory. Went to specific points in the directory to said, Mr. So-and-so is erecting a building, or here's a building that someone's living in. We used the coding of the directory. The map itself has the typical code that was used later, which is a red building means a brick building, a yellow building means a wood frame building. So we found lots of buildings that maybe were wood frame at the time and maybe got bricked later. And then we overlaid that with this current city atlas to see what we'd find and where there was a correlation. Everybody in our office took a block or two and went to town on just understanding what was there, and went out to photograph the buildings. We used historic photographs. In the 1850s, there was this amazing collection of photographs. When Toronto was trying to argue that it should be the capital of Canada, it sent a set of photographs to Britain to sort of say, here's what Toronto looks like, how big a metropolis, and it photographed pretty much everything. And so we were able to use those to say, well, is that the little building we're seeing now? You can look on the photo and see if you could spot the building. And then we came up with a grouping. I think we had about 200 buildings or so as a result, we went, oh boy, these are interesting. Most of them aren't recognized by the city as heritage buildings and not on the inventory. Even though they're right downtown, they were regarded as pretty plain, ordinary buildings. And they're what architects call the fabric of the city. They're fabric buildings. The landmarks were identified, but the fabric was sitting there. Many of them were in disastrous condition. This is a very cool bunch of buildings called the Robertson Cottages, which they're in the West End, around Niagara Street, between Adelaide and Richmond. And you can see they formed a distinctive pattern. They were military buildings, and they were duplex houses. They're now in disastrous condition, but you know what? I love these little buildings. And so the issue is, how do you, is the right approach to protecting buildings like this to say we're going to designate them and force owners to fix them up and restore them? Or are we just recognizing the passage of time that these are gradually going to disappear, and it would be nice to record and document them? So there's a question about how to respond to buildings in this condition. You can see that one's been slightly decapitated. And so we went through and looked at many, many buildings. There were a number that were listed or designated. You see the one in the middle. It's Toronto's first facade project. It's Old City Hall. now St. Lawrence Hall, and just the face of the building is retained. So many of these buildings were in quite a rough state. Surprising that the character and condition of these buildings. And the question to us, I think now, is what do we do? These are the oldest buildings in the city, and if we have age value connected to these buildings, are they buildings that we should be protecting? To what degree should we protect them, or should we be recording and documenting them, understanding them better, appreciating how they've gradually fallen into ruin? In some cases, we were less sanguine about that. This is on George Street. We actually found a grouping of George Street buildings which were vacant at the time, and so we actually did push City Council to protect these buildings, not until after a fire had happened in one of them. The councillor worked with us to basically force the city to recognize these buildings. They're now part of the Seton grouping of buildings that are being developed by the city. But these were actually quite fantastic buildings in their day, and they had amazing conditions on the interior, where the interiors were in damaged condition, but had their 1860s furnishings intact. And this is my last. I was trying to go through this quickly because I thought we were running out of time. So this is my last slide, which is besides just buildings, we're finding the form of the city was something you could read in this Bolton Atlas, the form, how the city was put together and how the pieces happened. So this is on the far left-hand side are the dumbbell parks. They're turned sideways, but the Victoria Square and Clarence Square. And you can see the middle is what they look like now. That's the precedent for them, which is Edinburgh Newtown, which is the dumbbell parks that are in Edinburgh Newtown. And this comes out of the military reserve. It comes out of Royal Engineers designing this whole section of Toronto near Fort York, but now in the military reserve. And these tracings or pieces of the city that you can actually spot and see now are something that, beyond the physical fabric of the city in terms of buildings, is something we also need to identify. And I think, and appreciate and understand, because there was immense potential and ambition in some of these schemes and some of the ways the city was built. And so I'll leave it at that. The open question is, if you can make a list of the oldest buildings in the city and they're not on a heritage inventory, what are we doing about them? Thank you.